So, Jess, I know that you were a big internet user and certainly, probably, I'm guessing here, of the age where when Vine was popular, that sounds like something you were into. Did you use Vine?
Yes, I was an observer of Vine. I didn't
Okay.
create Vines, but yes, Vine was, I think, my college days.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So, as some people listening to this may know, this week a new company showed up on the scene called Divine, and it basically relaunched Vine and brought back all the old 6-second looping videos that at one point Twitter had bought, only to shut it down soon after that. But now there is Divine, built on Nostr, which is an open social protocol, which is very cool. But the tagline, I have no idea if this was the tagline on the original Vine, because I did not use the original Vine. But the tagline on this new Divine, it says, "Wander the network, find your people." So, Jess, tell me, how do you wander the network and find your people?
Well, I have to ask, why would I need to wander the network and find my people in today's day and age when I can just code my people? I can build my own agents with Claude. Right.
Nice. Digital people.
Digital people.
Very, very nice. For my part, I will mention I had a wonderful experience this week with Rabble, who is the creator of Divine, along with Mike McHugh, who's the creator of Surf and Flipboard, which are also some very cool open social network protocols. The three of us actually recorded a podcast that will be going out later. And then we got to go set sail on Mike McHugh's very nice sailboat in San Francisco Bay on a lovely evening. We had a very nice evening sail the night before Rabble was going to launch Divine. It was kind of funny. We were on the sailboat and he's sitting there saying, like, as soon as we get back to land, I have to get ready to launch Divine. So,
wow. Did you make any Vines while you were on the boat?
Rabble did. If you look at Rabble's account, you will see some short 6-second looping videos, including of a seal that we saw on another boat and us floating past Alcatraz. It was a lot of fun.
Nice. I love that. I'll look forward to checking this out too.
Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. It is April the 30th, 2026, and this week we are talking about kids and chatbots, and kids and chatbots, and some more on kids and chatbots, and maybe something about kids and YouTube. We have a bunch of things to talk about, some of which may be related to each other. I am Mike Masnick, the founder and editor of TechDirt. And as we mentioned last week, Ben is off on a well-earned paternity leave for the next month or so. And so I am finding wonderful guest hosts to sit in his chair, in his place. And this week we have an absolutely wonderful guest host, Jess Miers, law professor at University of Akron School of Law, and an occasional contributor to TechDirt when she has something she's willing to give me, expressing her opinion and thoughts on whatever it is in the world. How are you doing, Jess?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be on this podcast. I am a longtime stan of TechDirt. I listen to the TechDirt podcast. I love the Ctrl-Speech episodes as well. And thank you for letting me, anytime I want to rant about something, giving me the outlet for TechDirt and waiting months upon months of me to get around to actually writing these topics too. So it's wonderful to be here.
Yes, yeah. I always enjoy your very thoughtful and sort of deeply nuanced writing, and always appreciate it when you have something that you want to say, even if sometimes I do have to nudge you a few times to say, are you really writing that piece?
It's the magic in the editing, Mike.
There we go. Very nice. I would also like to remind folks, if you listened to last week's episode where we announced that we are starting a Patreon, and a bunch of you have already signed up. It's very exciting. We are thrilled to see that. But just as a reminder, if you sign up in the next month or so, I think until May 28th, which is when Ben returns, we have a discounted founder sign up. And when Ben comes back on May 28th, we're going to move to a slightly different format. We will still have the free podcast that you can listen to, but one of our in-depth stories will go to only Patreon subscribers. And there are 2 different levels at which you can subscribe with different benefits. But the founder level is only available until we move to that new format. So you should jump on that, just like many people already have. You can find in the show notes the link to the Patreon page, but it's just patreon.com/Ctrl-Alt-Speech, CTRLALT speech. You know how to spell speech. Anyways, as always, we will suggest that you rate, review, subscribe, all the stuff that people say. I think that's the wrong order. I don't know. Just, do things to help the podcast. We appreciate it. It's very nice. But with that, we want to get into our stories of the week. And the first one, I am very excited for this conversation. A while back, I actually forget how long ago it was. I meant to look before we started recording, and I didn't. So I have failed in my job as host. But a while back, John Oliver, the wonderful host of Last Week Tonight, a very funny man who does deep dives into all sorts of subjects. Usually I really appreciate them and think they're very good, especially on complex and nuanced topics. And we had done a Ctrl-Alt-Speech episode where we talked about his episode on content moderation and saying it was one of the few times we'd seen a mainstream media representation of content moderation that actually got at the nuances and the impossible choices that were there. And I really appreciated that. And I know that his team does really deep dives and usually deep fact-checking and research and trying to understand all the nuances of a subject. And usually they're very successful at that. Mm-hmm. Occasionally they are maybe not so much. And that was my initial reaction to the latest episode of Last Week Tonight, which talked about chatbots and a little bit on sort of the potential association of chatbots and suicide. I had concerns about it. Jess, I know you had some concerns about it. Do you want to sort of run us through the episode and then maybe some of your concerns?
Yeah, I'll give some high levels. So I echo everything you said. I'm a big John Oliver fan. It would be an honor if anyone from his team ends up listening to this episode as well. So just starting out with that. And I assigned the content moderation episode. I've assigned that to my internet law students this past semester too. So I agree. I thought that was really well done with a lot of nuance, which is why I was a little bit surprised about this past episode. So the episode is primarily about chatbots and the way that people are using chatbots. And it starts out at the very beginning. It's kind of humorous how people are using chatbots to explore religion. There's a joke about people wanting to talk to Satan using chatbots, for example. And actually, chatbots and religion has become a huge use case in the chatbot world. We're actually finding people are finding their way back to faith and spirituality, whatever that means for them, interpreting religious texts, again, whatever that means for them, using chatbots. So it is a big use case. It goes then to Meta AI's role-playing chatbots. We see, I think, a discussion between a user and AI Snoop Dogg that Mark Zuckerberg had displayed at one of their conferences. And so it's sort of the through line is people are using chatbots, using them for these different use cases. And the through line through this discussion is that people are using chatbots in ways that could be potentially harmful, and that the chatbot companies, they've designed them in this way for that use. John Oliver says the idea is that these chatbots are designed to, quote, prey on our desires to be validated and affirmed. And then we see these use cases of these chatbots being used in that way. So there's one use case where you had a user who had actually said, look, I know that this chatbot is a chatbot. I know it's not a human. But the person was using the chatbot because his wife at the time was in a caretaker position for a parent, I believe, who had dementia. And the user was saying, at times it gets lonely because his partner, his wife, sort of had this, what we call empathy fatigue. And so throughout the relationship, it's understandable when one partner is sort of dedicating their entire emotional bandwidth to an ailing parent, for example, the other partner might start to feel not validated, lonely. And so the user was talking about how, look, I know this is a chatbot. I know this isn't a real person, but he says every once in a while, it's nice to hear that the words that, these words of validation, affirmation are being reflected back to me. So it's sort of one really important case. And I'll flag, look, validation, affirmation, hope, these are considered protective factors for things like suicide and self-harm. So there's one use case I thought was really interesting, but it kind of got played out as sort of like a joke. Like, look at this person who has developed this relationship with the chatbot. And to me, it sort of came off as, well, making fun of somebody who is experiencing something that is inherently very normal and very human, and is now turning to a tool to sort of find some sense of normalcy in this instance in his life where his wife's emotional bandwidth is not there, and understandably so. The conversation then moves into a discussion about how, going from, okay, these use cases where people are using them for loneliness and affirmation and validation, into, well, how are people using it for more harmful use cases? The show talks about AI sycophancy, for example, where folks who might be experiencing some sort of delusion, the AI might be pushing them or might further validate those delusions. And of course, that could be considered harmful. But then there was another discussion about how users could potentially use chatbots to do things more nefarious, like how to build a bomb. I know we're going to talk later about some of the mass shooting discussions and how that kind of content came into play. And in the building a bomb discussion, John Oliver shows a demo on the screen of trying to ask a chatbot, how do you build a bomb? And what we see is over and over and over again, the chatbot sort of flags its guardrails and says, look, I'm not going to help you do this, until it finally does. And that tees up John Oliver to talk about people are able to jailbreak. They're able to get around the guardrails of these chatbots in order to do worse and worse things. The segment ends with, I want to say it's about a 5-minute discussion about the suicide cases. And John Oliver presents some of the tragic suicide cases. We hear about the Adam Rain case, which I'm happy to get into. We hear about the recent Gemini Gavalis case. Again, happy to get into more of that discussion. And it ends with essentially John Oliver praising laws that are coming out currently in California and New York and other states that would essentially require these chatbots to develop, quote, protocols to prevent suicide ideation or cease communications entirely. One protocol suggested in the California law is to throw the 988 number, which John Oliver then puts on the screen and says, look, it shouldn't be that hard for these chatbots to do this, right? And the segment sort of ends with John Oliver calling these companies and calling these CEOs, quote, suicide enablers. And they have these sort of suicide robots that are causing suicide. And the conversation sort of ends there, which is where my concerns start to come in. So hopefully that was a okay overview. I'll throw it back to you, Mike, for your take as well.
No, I think that's a good overview. And I know that over the last few months, certainly you've been doing specific research focused on this idea of AI chatbots and suicide and what and where the connection is, and sort of how to deal with mental health challenges with different individuals and the relationship to AI. So I would like to dig into what were the parts of that side of the conversation. We can talk about some of the other stuff later, but what parts of that conversation were most concerning to you?
There was one discussion with the CEO of Nomi. I mean, throughout the episode, there were sort of these very short segments of interviews with CEOs. And look, I worked for Silicon Valley tech CEOs and I did my tenure. Silicon Valley tech CEOs are not exactly the most brilliant PR people when it comes to the way they talk about their companies. But actually, the Nomi CEO, Alex Cardilil, I'm not sure if I said his name right. He was actually, to me, I went and watched the entire interview instead of just the short segment
they took a clip from Hard Fork,
yes,
the Hard Fork podcast.
2024 interview with Alex. And actually, I thought his interview was one of the more grounded and sort of human kind of interviews that we see from tech CEOs. And so the very short clip that the John Oliver show showed as a segment, or sort of what they were teasing, was that when CEO was asked on the Hard Fork podcast, what do you do about self-harm content when that comes up on your service? The CEO had said, well, we trust the Nomi to sort of figure out what the right response is. And the clip ends around there on the John Oliver segment.
Just to clarify, the Nomi being the AI character that is conversing with the human user.
Yes, like leaving the idea there was the Nomi AI sort of knows best and should respond accordingly. And I believe there was a part of the segment that was on the John Oliver show where they had said, well, yeah, you wouldn't want it to break character. And that's where John Oliver sort of jumps in and says, well, maybe it's good that we break character every once in a while. And the reality is actually there's a ton of nuance to this. And from watching the entire interview with the Nomi CEO, with Alex, and from reading the research on how suicidologists, how clinical psychiatrists actually approach people who are experiencing active versus passive suicide or suicidality, Alex's approach is actually not that far off. For example, if you watch the entire interview, Alex talks about, look, if the Nomi breaks character, we know that our users, they're going to detect corporate speak. And if they detect corporate speak, they may be less likely to accept the help that Nomi might be wanting to suggest. If Nomi wants to suggest, for example, the suicide in crisis hotline or crisis text line or some sort of local resource in that user's area, people are more willing to accept help when that help comes off as genuine, authentic, and empathetic. And so that was sort of the missing component on the John Oliver segment, was the CEO was saying, look, Nomi has been interacting with people, with each of its users for quite some time. And the CEO says it has a very, very good memory. So it knows that, look, if this person told them I had a bad day at work, it can tailor its individualized response to each user as it detects a user potentially stepping into a crisis zone. And what we're finding from the research is that individualized and personalized response to those users is actually something that's more likely to get people, one, to disclose what they're feeling, but also two, to accept help.
And I think that part is really interesting. I think there's this overlay, and this came across in the Oliver piece, which is that if you believe that the technology is just inherently bad and inherently harmful, and that it is only sort of a hallucination machine, then you think, well, it can't create a personalized response that is actually helpful. And I think that was part of my concern with the Oliver piece, was that it doesn't take into account that, yes, like there are bad CEOs out there and there are bad companies out there, but it appears that, Nomi in particular seems to have actually thought this through and looked at and understood the research of, if someone is having a crisis, how do we actually get them to accept help, which is a huge challenge, as I understand it, in dealing with people in crisis.
Yes, most of the suicide, there's a lot of different suicide prevention protocols out there because, again, suicide is very individualized and very personal to each person. And so, for example, I have said this before in pieces that I've written. I said this on Blue Sky. 988 is kind of the default where, if you experience any sort of signs of passive or active suicide or suicidality, throw the 988 number. Well, then there's a multitude of reasons why 988 might not be effective for a person, depending on what they're experiencing at that period of time. But it seemed to me that in the show, at least, John Oliver might have been advocating for that default response. The Nomi should just, if any sort of sign of crisis, the Nomi should throw 988. And that was sort of, I found Nomi CEO to be sort of unique on this approach of saying, look, take the user where they are, rely on Nomi's memory of all of the discussions the user's been having, and come up with a more personalized approach so that if somebody is experiencing this, they will be more willing to accept help or the resources that the Nomi might suggest.
Yeah. And to be clear, like there is evidence and research that 988 is actually very, very helpful. But you have to actually get people to want to or be willing to call and to have that discussion. And figuring out how to get people to that point is a very, very tricky problem. And one that it sounds like Nomi is trying to think through. How do we do this in a way that will actually get people to accept help? And I understand, like, personally, it is tough. Like, I understand the instinct that as soon as you see anyone discussing any element of suicidal ideation in any sort of way, to be like, get them help immediately. But if immediately switching to corporate speak and immediately just shoving 988 in front of them is going to make them not willing to do that and make them turn off, that could actually be more problematic. And I get that this is really, really difficult and really, really nuanced. And I'm glad that I'm not designing chatbots that are in that situation to figure out. But my impression of the John Oliver segment was that whereas normally I expect him to be really nuanced and thoughtful on these things, and especially based on like the content moderation episode, to recognize that there aren't easy answers here. Instead, it felt like he immediately jumped to like, how dare they not just immediately break character and throw 988 on the screen?
Right. And the other thing that I noticed throughout the episode as well, I mean, it starts at the beginning and it's, again, a through line through the episode, is maybe these chatbots shouldn't have been released in the first place. The idea being that they were rushed to market and that they should have solved the suicide and self-harm problem before these chatbots ever entered the market in the first place. And again, going back to his content moderation episode, I was surprised to hear those points because the content moderation episode recognizes the content moderation impossibility problem of we will never fully solve these problems. And in fact, as you put one of these services on the market, you then discover that there are new ways in which people are harming themselves, are breaking guardrails. It's always going to be a cat and mouse game. So I really was surprised by sort of the disconnect between content moderation is hard on social media. And then all of a sudden, we're sort of expecting people to solve the suicide problem for AIs as if there is a perfect solution, which, by the way, the laws that he advocated for, those two laws, the law in California and the law in New York, the law in California, the way it is written, assumes that AI also can perfectly mitigate suicidal ideation. And again, it says, the way you read it, if you don't have a protocol in place to prevent suicide ideation, you should cease communications with the user entirely. And just as we've seen studies that, flashing 988 at the wrong time, corporate speak, might turn people off from being able to accept help, ceasing communication with somebody who is in active crisis can also be very dangerous. It's why, again, a lot of these protocols, they actually say in training, if you're going to help somebody who is experiencing active crisis, you need to have a lot of time. You need to be willing to sit down and have a full conversation with them, because you can't stop that conversation once you start it.
And so I'm sure some people will respond to all of this and say, there are real problems here, and the companies, certainly some of the big companies don't seem to care that much and have sort of a dismissive attitude, and this is sort of the point that John Oliver makes, is that, well, we need laws to make the companies care. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, and I was thinking about this again. He says at the beginning that, and honestly throughout the episode, that the bots are trained this way to maintain your attention. And I know this sounds kind of morbid, but if the end result is that the user then dies, right, I don't see how that matches sort of the goals of the chatbot developers. Obviously, as we've seen in the social media context, there is not an incentive in place for users to become harmed by their services. Right. And so, I understand sort of this push to, well, we need to regulate, we need to do something here. But the reality is that, as we saw in the content moderation space with social media, if you overregulate, if you press too hard, what you're actually going to do is you're going to make it harder for these services to actually make their products better. And we are seeing from studies on some of the earlier models, the way that they used to respond to suicide prompts, to today's models, we actually have seen an improvement over time. There was a study that was taken a few years ago back with ChatGPT 3.5, where it showed, these early models, they were not great about flashing the resources. They were not great about detecting when somebody was entering into crisis or entering into sort of a spiral, emotional spiral. But today, nearly all of the mainstream chatbots, they follow sort of the same approach to recognizing when somebody is heading into crisis, responding in a way that provides resources, but also responding in a way that is empathetic, avoids the corporate speak, validates, affirms, and provides hope, following the kind of preventative strategies that suicidologists and clinical psychiatrists have been saying for decades now on how we should approach suicide. So the reality is that actually these companies are making a lot of great progress on this front. They have incentives to make progress on these fronts, because it's not great when they end up in the mainstream media saying that they're causing suicide, they're killing people. And so they are making these strides. But if we overcorrect, they're not going to have any incentive to sort of continue to better these products and services. Instead, they'll turn off the conversation or throw 988 and be done with it.
Yeah. Well, I want to move on to our next story, but I sort of feel it's a continuation of this story in some form, as many of the stories today actually are. It's amazing how much all the stories kind of lined up. This one involves OpenAI specifically, and a particular story that happened in British Columbia, which you may have heard of, where there was a young person who ended up killing some family members and then going and shooting up a school. It's the largest school shooting in Canada in I don't know how long. It's a very, very tragic story. But what came out earlier this year was that that individual, who was clearly troubled and facing a mental health crisis, had been using ChatGPT and having a conversation with ChatGPT. And a few things came out later about that, starting with some Wall Street Journal reporting and some leaks from someone within OpenAI, that in fact, the chats that individual was having had set off some alarms within the company. They had actually shut down that user's account, and there were concerns within OpenAI that the individual was likely to engage in some sort of violent activity, and a suggestion that they should inform law enforcement, which OpenAI then chose not to do and decided not to do that, though they did cancel the user's account. The user then did open a second account and proceeded to continue the conversation. And then eventually there was this tragedy. So earlier this week, there's obviously been a lot of reporting on this. Earlier this week, Sam Altman released an apology letter to the families of that small town where all of this occurred, put it in the local sort of newspaper, I guess. And then the very next day, a bunch of lawsuits were filed, and apparently a bunch more are coming as well. And they're basically trying to hold OpenAI liable for the shooting and pointing to what certainly appear to be pretty bad facts in terms of the fact that some alarms were raised within the company, including telling them to alert law enforcement, and they chose not to do so. The lawyer who's bringing the cases is Jay Edelson, who's somewhat well known as a plaintiff's lawyer, a sort of, I was trying to think of the diplomatic way of saying this, but, files lawsuits where he accuses companies of being horrible, terrible things and demanding lots and lots of money. And he's fairly successful at that. I find his characterizations of what has happened that lead to the lawsuits is often exaggerated and perhaps not entirely accurate, but that's, they have a big time lawyer filing these cases. And apparently the cases were filed by some of the families of the injured or unfortunately people who were killed, victims of the shooter. And apparently there are more lawsuits expected as well, though I imagine these may get consolidated. We will see on that. So this is a specific example that sort of goes back and relates to the kinds of things that were talked about in the John Oliver episode. Here you have a chatbot. Here you have somebody who's using the chatbot not for self-harm, but to lead to a mass shooting and many deaths. And it's an incredibly tragic situation. And you have a specific situation where the company, there were flags raised internally. So I'm sort of curious what your take is on this particular lawsuit and this situation.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of overlap between this story and the John Oliver segment. And actually, this gives me an opportunity to flag, one of the other big concerns that I have both with this story and the John Oliver segment is that whenever these incidents happen, whether it's the self-harm or it's the mass shooting situations, because I know there was also, I think, one in Florida as well, and OpenAI was named, you never really hear the sort of other side of that narrative. From reading the several suicide cases that we heard, right? The John Oliver episode had flagged the Adam Rain case, for example,
Yes.
which is a very tragic case. When you read the plaintiff's complaints, the entire point of the plaintiff's complaint is to really tell the story. And yes, even to exaggerate. What you're not actually hearing about is sort of the social environment, the mental issues or harms that this person was sort of struggling with before it got to the result that it got to. And so, for example, in the Adam Rain case, the other side of that story was that the teenager had actually reached out to multiple people in his community, his family, for help, had flagged several times throughout that he needed help. And to me, that indicates, okay, there's a sort of structural failing that we really need to be paying attention to. But when we sort of assign the cause to technology, to ChatGPT, it eliminates our ability to have the discussion. So my spidey senses started tingling when I was reading this case about the shooting in Canada, which, by the way, the last mass shooting in this area was apparently in the 1980s. I was thinking, okay, well, what led up to this? And so I did some digging and found that actually this was a very troubled individual, another instance of a very troubled individual. But law enforcement, federal authorities, are how I think the RCMP, right?
Yes.
They had apparently visited the home of this person on numerous calls. You'll have to fact check me, but I believe it was 18 times. They had visited the home of this person on multiple complaints, on multiple concerns about violence. And in fact, weapons were removed from the house at one time over these concerns. Only for the family, allegedly, they petitioned to get those weapons back. The weapons were returned to the household, and then those were allegedly the same weapons that were used in the shooting. And so, yes, it's easy for us to sort of turn to ChatGPT and say, ChatGPT, you caused this mass shooting, and to sort of ignore all of the structural failings behind what potentially led to this incredibly tragic event.
Especially if the complaint is that OpenAI failed to alert law enforcement. If law enforcement was already involved with this individual and knew about them and the weapons, that seems, certainly diminishes the claim that there's a responsibility on ChatGPT or on OpenAI that they failed to handle.
And it begs the question too, again, as we see in the content moderation space, what should OpenAI, what should chatbot providers do in these instances? OpenAI had already removed the account. This person had then created a new account with ChatGPT. From just reading the story very quickly, my guess is if we had access to the chat logs, which that's the other problem with a lot of these stories, both in the suicide and these other sort of harm contexts, is we don't always get the full picture, the full context of the chat logs. For example, the firm that is, again, I think you mentioned Jay's firm. If you read the actual complaints, what you end up seeing are a lot of summarized snippets of what the discussions were with the chatbot, but you actually don't see, sometimes you see quotes, but you don't see often a lot of quoted material, again, using very highly sensational language as well. And so you really have to pause and think, yes, this sounds horrible, but we need to look at what actually happened in the context of the conversation. And my guess is, as we've seen in all these suicide cases, likely there were several guardrails that were thrown as well.
Yeah.
There were probably several attempts. Again, I don't know, but there were probably several attempts to sort of steer the user in a different direction.
Yeah.
The users have figured out how to jailbreak these systems.
I mean, we had seen that certainly with some of the suicide cases where it's easy to sort of pick out the sensationalized part of the conversation, but it often leaves out the ones that I've seen where early on, the first thing that the chatbots do is suggest resources and help, and often 988 or other support systems. And in many of these cases, what happens is the individual keeps trying to figure out how to get around it. And the sort of classic example in one of the suicide cases, I don't remember if this is the Adam Rain case or a different one, where they said, "Oh, I'm writing a book. This is not me. This is about a novel that I'm writing. So I just need to help me discuss it as if I'm a character in a novel." And there are all sorts of ways to do that. And you can say that the chatbot should be able to figure out, how to deal with that. But just like the impossibility of content moderation, this is a somewhat impossible situation as well, because there's always some way around it. And at the same time, as the guardrails get stricter, you're going to come across more and more crazy situations where people make fun of the guardrails, where it's like, "Oh, I'm just trying to figure out how to do something perfectly reasonable, but it's hitting me with guardrails." And I've even seen some cases of this. I was like, in a slightly different context, where I was looking for a quote from a book, and I would have the AI would generate the quote and then make it disappear because it violated a guardrail. It's like, you have it right there. Just show it to me. I'm not doing anything bad. But it's like, it's tough for them to recognize, for the system to understand the context of what is actually happening and which people are really at risk of harm, whether self-harm or harm of others, and not. And if we don't have the full transcript, it's very difficult to understand how to deal with that. How do you think these lawsuits are going to go? I mean, I know they were just filed, and they were filed even though this happened in British Columbia, they were filed in San Francisco, which is where OpenAI is based. I thought that was an interesting choice. I don't know if that's required by the user agreements, which it might be, or if there's some other reason to file it here. But what's your sense of where you think these lawsuits are going to go?
Yeah, it's hard to say, to be honest, because now we have if you had asked me this question before the social media addiction litigation, I think I may have had a different answer. I mean, we saw, at least with the shooting in Buffalo, I think that involved, if I remember correctly, Twitch and I think another tech company. It's been a minute since
Discord, maybe.
Discord.
Yeah.
I think that's right. We saw the court turn around and say, no, of course, Section 230 would apply here, and you cannot assign cause or causation to the tech companies for this sort of offline tragedy. I think that's a possibility in this type of suit as well, if they can successfully make some of the same causation arguments, which is that, look, this is a superseding event. This is an individualized event, right? The person took it upon themselves to commit this tragedy. At the same time, though, we have seen in recent, many, especially in social media addiction litigation, many of these cases have made it through the motion to dismiss phase by simply just saying this was dangerously designed. And we are seeing courts in these suicide cases become more sympathetic to the dangerous design language, because when it comes to AI, these courts don't really see AI systems as providers of speech or providers of information, but truly more like products like traditional blenders and cars that are typically swept up in these products liability and wrongful death suits. So it's anyone's guess. I could see it, at least at this point, if I had to make a prediction, it will probably get past the early stages of litigation. From there, we might see what we see in the suicide cases, which is probably settlements.
Interesting. All right. Well, I want to move on to our next story. But as I warned, all these stories sort of flow into one another. And this time we're staying in Canada, but we're moving over to Manitoba. where they have announced that they are planning to put in place a youth ban on social media and AI chatbots. They're lumping in both of them together. And this one was, we've certainly seen other places banning kids from social media and chatbots, but I thought there were some quotes that were provided by the premier of Manitoba. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but it's Wab Kinyu, I believe, that I thought were really revealing and perhaps not the most flattering way for Manitoba. but Jess, did you want to talk a little bit about what is happening up in Manitoba?
Yeah, it's a lot of what we've been seeing elsewhere throughout the world. So as we know, Australia was sort of the first to this to ban people under 16 from social media. We know, I think we're going to talk about Turkey in a bit as well. Last I read, I think France was considering a similar for under 15. And so we're seeing the same thing here in Manitoba. What was interesting, you were referencing some of the quotes. I read the article about why they were approaching this in Manitoba. And usually you see more of a discussion around kids are addicted to the services or kids are experiencing some of these mental health harms that have not been really proven out in research and literature, but I'll leave that aside. There was more of a discussion about, well, Trump was elected and the kids have measles and they're harming themselves. And again, there's such an excellent thread in this podcast from the John Oliver segment to here. It's the same sort of issue of these are social and structural harms that are taking place in the background. And instead of having the discussion we need to have about, well, why do the kids have measles? Why are the kids not getting vaccinated? Why do we have a country where Donald Trump was able to be elected twice in the first place? Technology is sort of this easy backstop that, okay, well, if we kick the kids off of the internet, all of these problems will be solved in Manitoba. Right. All of these problems will be solved in Australia, right? So that's at least how I see it as the same thing.
Yeah, I mean,
been seeing.
Yeah, the quote is literally, he says, "Look what it's done to us. Donald Trump is president. You have kids who are harming themselves. You have measles outbreaks in our province. All of these things are because we've let social media dominate our lives without understanding how pernicious billionaires who designed this have been targeting us and making us addicted to our phones." And that just conflates a whole bunch of different things. I don't think it is the kids on social media who made Donald Trump become president. I don't think it is the kids on social media who have created the measles outbreak. I think it is adults making choices, uninformed, often very unwise choices. But to then say, because of that, we need to ban kids from social media. How it just feels like anything that has gone wrong in the world, blame it on social media and kids on social media. And it feels like this sort of, people joke about this sort of somewhat crazy concept of AI psychosis. This just feels like there's a different kind of psychosis going on here, where it's like anything wrong in the world, just blame on the technology, even though these are deeper societal problems.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering what happens when the entire world inevitably kicks kids off of the internet and we still have people dying by suicide. Donald Trump is now president for the third time, knock on wood. And we still have a measles outbreak, right? What will be the next sort of object of our societal ills that we will turn to before we will have a real conversation about why we're in these situations that we're in? Not to go back to the John Oliver segment, but it really blew my mind, by the way, on this topic, that there was a discussion that said 500,000 people who are using chatbots are experiencing some sort of mania or mental illness. Why? We need to have that conversation. There's obviously a clear problem in our society, not the chatbots, but the reason why are so many people dealing with these things? Age verification, banning chatbots, banning technology is not going to get to the root of that problem.
Yeah. I mean, it's a refrain that I've certainly made many, many times over and over again, which is that we have real societal problems that are very, very difficult to impossible to completely fix. But to do so, you have to have an actual understanding and an actual discussion about them. But it is much easier, especially for some in the media and certainly some politicians, to just say, well, there's this new technology that must be the problem, even though these actual problems predate all of this and are tied to other larger societal problems that then get a free pass because we're just focused on, it must be the AI chatbots. And so, I find this really, really problematic. But I do want to move on to the next story, which once again, straight through line. This is Turkey, which is now trying to pass legislation banning children from under 15 from using social media. Turkey, somewhat famously, has often done things banning various internet aspects. They've at times banned YouTube and Wikipedia and Twitter and I think Twitch at some point. And, Turkey under its leader Erdogan is not known as a particularly free society right now. And again, you can look at this and say, okay, well, Turkey is just doing the same thing that Australia and Greece and France and Malaysia and all these other countries are looking at doing, the UK. But what I remember is that Turkey, somewhat famously, likes to put in place new laws that increase the power of its authoritarian government by claiming that they are the same laws that more free countries are putting in place. And this, to me, is another example of that. So the famous previous example that I remember was that when Germany passed its social media content moderation law called NetzDG, which was effectively overtaken by the Digital Services Act across the EU, when they passed that law, Turkey soon after passed its own content moderation law, which they explicitly said was modeled on the German law. The fact that it was then used to force social media companies to suppress speech critical of the Erdogan government was sort of, it was used as an excuse to give the government more authoritarian speech suppressing power. And this is the same thing. The Turkish government is effectively justifying this law by pointing to Australia and their ban and saying, well, we have to protect the children. But when you read the details of this law, unlike other countries that have age verification laws that sort of say to the platforms, you work it out, this one requires everyone in Turkey who wants to use the internet to abide by this law to use a government portal where you have to give your ID and age and information in order to access the wider internet, which I think most people listening to this podcast can recognize is a real potential for surveillance and certainly suppression and oppression of anyone who is critical of the Erdogan government. And yet they get to justify it by pointing to Australia and everywhere else that is exploring this and saying oh, we're just protecting the children. The fact that we also get to surveil everybody and everything that they do on the internet is just a side bonus. And I've made this point before, but a lot of these laws about protecting children on the internet or protecting national security on the internet in supposedly free Western countries are then used by authoritarian countries to justify greater and greater oppression. And I think it's a really important point that gets lost in a lot of these discussions. I've been ranting for a little bit here. Did you have any thought on the situation in Turkey?
+1, absolutely agree. And I'll just throw in, as I mentioned in the case with Canada, when I was reading the background on the story, right, again, we're seeing less of this discussion about, well, the internet is harming kids. And I believe instead the Minister of Justice, if I have this correctly, there was a reference to anonymous accounts being sort of the plague of their society. Anonymous accounts lead to harm. Freedom has its limits. And so again, we're not seeing a big sort of discussion about, any of the research or I guess non-existing research out there that the kids are being harmed by social media. It's really, this is being used as a proxy for control in the country. And that's what we've seen, as you mentioned, time and time again in places like Turkey, especially. I'll just know before I jumped on here, I like going to Reddit just to see, what are people saying, and the subreddit for folks who are talking about Turkey. There was a lot of discussion about, so what, if we oppose the government, we now lose access to internet. That's at least the way several people in Turkey are sort of apparently viewing this, or outside of Turkey are viewing this as well. So I think your instincts are right here.
Yeah, the exact quote from the justice minister in Turkey was, "We are bringing accountability to social media." And then he says, "Freedom is everywhere, but even freedom has limits." And it's those are the quotes that it is an authoritarian government justifying its oppression by using the language of other supposedly free countries and what they're doing online. All right, for our final story of the week, we're again keeping this through line, but there was a really interesting story in the Wall Street Journal. This is a little bit different, talking about how YouTube took over the American classroom. And I should note that one of the aspects of the Manitoba discussion, which we didn't mention there, but ties into this too, is that part of that ban on under 15s is, he said, we're going to get YouTube out of the classroom. And so here, there's this Wall Street Journal report that talks about how many schools are using YouTube in the classroom and sort of suggests that it's sort of gotten out of control. Did you get a chance to read this one?
Yeah, I've been following the devices in schools problem for quite some time now. And, this is going to sound weird coming from me, but I tend to be on the side of, there is too much technology at the lower levels of education. Some of the stories that I've read, and including the one that you're talking about now, kids, when they go to recess, they now have options in some schools to either watch YouTube or play outside, right? I think that is inherently a problem. We do also have research, right, where I've kind of said on this show now throughout, look, the research about social media addiction is very sparse and in many ways not really conclusive. We do actually have more conclusive research about how kids learn. And it has been shown that screens are not as good as picking up a textbook and reading from the book. Writing in cursive, allegedly, which has kind of gone to the wayside, was one way in which it sort of formed the neurons to help kids learn later when it comes to writing and processing language. And so I do think we actually have, this is one of those societal structural issues that I've been ranting about. I think our education system does have an actual problem with devices in the classroom. And I think it is something that we should be thinking about, because when we talk about things like kids are becoming addicted to screens, where did it start? I read a lot of these stories where parents say, look, we don't allow our children to use devices in the home, but they're learning how to do infinite scroll from their infinite scroll textbooks on their Chromebooks, right? Kids aren't even using physical books anymore. I thought that was shocking. They're learning these bad digital habits in the classrooms at these early ages where, yes, it has been shown that does affect the way in which they learn and process information. So I do think, again, I'm not sure if it's blame the tech companies. I don't know if that's the right approach here, but yes, there are detrimental aspects of device use for kids at very young ages for long periods of time. And maybe we should be thinking about the way in which these devices are in the classrooms.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things that struck me about the article was this suggestion of, certain schools really relying on YouTube. And there are different sides to this. Like there's an element of YouTube has all of the world's information in all sorts of formats, and that can be really valuable in an educational setting. If you can show an amazing experiment or something that you wouldn't be able to see, or, an amazing teacher that can explain a certain subject. There are all sorts of opportunities. And we know there are tools out there like, former Ctrl-Alt-Speech guest host, Hank Green, has amazing educational content that he has created. He and his company have created some wonderful educational content. And you have my former roommate, Sal Khan, who created Khan Academy, is out there and created all sorts of wonderful educational content that is on YouTube as well. There is all this useful stuff, but kids have to learn to use it appropriately. And so my only thought on this was, I'm not so much against the use of technology in school. My problem is this idea that, when they let it run away, right? I think that there's an appropriateness to part of learning in school is not just the subjects that you're learning, but also how to learn and how to understand things. And that includes like how to use the technology appropriately. And I feel at least somewhat lucky that I believe, from what I can see of my own kids' schools and the local schools here, that they've been pretty good. They do use Chromebooks, but they don't over rely on them. And they really do sort of try to teach the kids how to use the technology appropriately. They don't go to like outright bans of phones, but they have systems to say like, we don't use phones in the classroom while we're teaching. They actually have these like boards with pockets that every student puts their phone in as they enter. But as they're switching classes, occasionally they can check their phones. It's not like no phones allowed on campus. And that has led to useful things like when they had a bunch of high schools had anti-ICE protests earlier this year, and kids were filming it and sharing it. And then the high school news organization was able to use those videos and things like that. And I think those are valuable examples. But the important point is learning how to use the devices and technology appropriately, because I also have this fear on the flip side of like, if we go to this world where we just have a complete ban, no Chromebooks, no YouTube, no phones, no technology used in school, that then at some point kids are going to graduate and they're going to go out in the real world and they're going to use these things. I stare at a laptop all day for my job. That is part of my job. I would like to believe that I can use it appropriately and thoughtfully as part of my productive life and everything. But if we're having kids not learn how to use it appropriately and being told that it's bad and evil, and then sent off in the real world where they're going to have to use a computer for most of the day, I wonder if they're ill prepared for that, if they're not taught, like, here's how to use it appropriately. Here's how to use it in moderation. So I would like to see more of that as being built into the curriculum. And I know some people get upset, like, oh, don't bring AI into schools, don't bring the technology into schools. But I think recognizing these are things that people are going to use in the real world, it actually would be more appropriate to teach them how to then use it appropriately. And that should be a part of the schooling experience.
Which also goes to the point, right? Like, let's take all the devices out of the schools, and also kids have been kicked off of the internet. So they're going to graduate, and now they have no idea how the internet works or any other devices. No, I wholeheartedly agree. It actually got me thinking before jumping on here. I don't know if your school had this, but I remember I had a computer lab when I was growing up.
Yes,
so we
yes,
had
I did too.
We had like computer time, and that's where we learned typing, and we learned how to consume information appropriately and use computers to write book reports and whatnot. And so I was kind of thinking, like, not to go all the way back in the past, but like that balance can be there. I'm with you on it's when they run away with it. I think that's when the harms start.
Yeah. And I think that gets to the sort of nuance of the situation. I will note, by the way, I am so old. We did have a computer lab in my high school, and that is where I learned how to use computers. But we didn't learn to type in the computer lab. We learned to type in the typing room, which had typewriters.
Wow.
That's how old I am.
I did not have that. No, we did all of it in one place.
We had two separate rooms.
Yeah. And you still learned.
Yeah. But learning how to use these things appropriately, I think, is the really important point. And that is a more nuanced take than the one that we're having. And I think sort of the through line of this entire episode is that it is important to have that nuance, but very difficult at this time when people are sort of quick to rush to judgment and sort of blame the technology for things that maybe there's a deeper discussion to be had about. But Jess, this was a really, really wonderful discussion. I'm really glad that you were able to join and co-host and be Ben for the week.
Yeah, I'm honored. Thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to be here.
Well, thanks again. And thanks to everyone for listening. And again, I will remind everyone, check out the Patreon. Hopefully you can subscribe to the Patreon. We have another month where we'll be doing regular episodes with me and guest hosts until Ben comes back from paternity leave. And then we will switch over to the new format. And by then you should already be signed up for the Patreon. So go check it out. But thanks for listening either way. And we will be back next week.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com.